On Saturday, August 9th, 2026, I visited the Taste of the Danforth, excited to see the festival return after being absent for the past several years. I had fond expectations of what this event used to represent: crowds filling the streets, reasonably priced Greek food, lively entertainment, families enjoying themselves, and a genuine sense of community. Unfortunately, after spending time walking through the event and observing what was happening, I can sum up my experience in one sentence. Welcome back to the waste of the Danforth. I arrived expecting large crowds, long food lines, and the usual festival atmosphere. Instead, as you can see in the background footage, there were surprisingly sparse crowds in many areas. The crowd did grow later in the evening, but even then, the overall atmosphere seemed considerably weaker than what I remember from previous years. At first, I was actually relieved. There were no long lines at most of the food vendors and other stalls. I quickly realized, however, that there was a very simple reason for this. The prices were outrageous. A bottle of water was being sold for approximately $2, while a rather unimpressive souvlaki stick served on a small piece of pita was going for around $10. For a street festival that is supposed to attract families and ordinary people, these prices are difficult to justify. The food portions did not appear to match the prices either. What should have been an affordable opportunity to sample different Greek foods had instead become an expensive outing where many people seemed to be looking at the prices and deciding to simply walk away. I couldn't help but get the impression that some merchants were trying to make up for the years the festival was shut down by charging as much as they possibly could. If that was the strategy, it may have backfired. A festival depends on people buying things. If prices are so high that people refuse to purchase, empty food stalls and short lines are hardly a sign of success. The entertainment was not much better. The music was at best mediocre, and the sound system left a lot to be desired. There was little about the performances that created the excitement and energy I associate with a major street festival. Some people were clearly enjoying themselves, and it is important to acknowledge that. There were certainly individuals and families who came out determined to have a good time. But overall, the atmosphere seemed more like people wandering around looking for something to do rather than participating in a vibrant festival. The children's rides were another major disappointment. Prices were extremely high, with approximately $5 for a single slide ride and between $7.50 and $10 for some of the other rides. There were obviously many children who desperately wanted to ride them. You could hear children screaming and asking their parents. But the prices appeared to put many of those rides out of reach for ordinary families. A street festival should be something families can enjoy together. Charging $7.50 or $10 for a short children's ride makes the experience prohibitively expensive, especially for families with several children. A parent with 3 children could easily spend $30 or more on just a couple of rides. That is not what I would consider family-friendly entertainment. Interestingly, one of the longest lines I observed was not for the expensive festival food or rides. It was at Foodland, where people were lining up for a $5 mango on a stick, or approximately $3 for 3 pieces of watermelon. That tells you something about what people were actually willing to spend. There was clearly demand for inexpensive food and snacks. Dollarama was also a major hit, particularly its drink cooler, which apparently could not be restocked quickly enough. People were looking for affordable drinks rather than paying inflated festival prices. Again, this seemed to demonstrate that visitors were interested in value and were prepared to spend money when the price was reasonable. There were also the usual homeless individuals and people behaving erratically roaming around the area. Fortunately, the significant police presence appeared to keep things generally under control. I did not see major incidents, and the visible police presence seemed to provide some reassurance to visitors. The weather, at least, cooperated. It was an overcast and relatively cool day, which actually made it quite comfortable for walking around. People could stroll along the Danforth without having to deal with extreme heat. Unfortunately, many appeared to be doing exactly that, walking, looking, and buying very little. RBC had provided a limited number of chairs for tired visitors, which was a welcome gesture. Unfortunately, those chairs were quickly occupied, and finding a seat was almost impossible. For an event attracting thousands of people, there seemed to be surprisingly little consideration given to providing places to sit. There were also some lines for free giveaways and promotional items. Those lines were noticeably more popular than many of the commercial food stalls. Once again, this seemed to demonstrate that people were willing to participate when they were not being asked to pay inflated prices. Overall, I found the return of Taste of the Danforth extremely disappointing. I came expecting a celebration of Greek culture, food, music, and community. Instead, I saw overpriced food, expensive children's rides, mediocre entertainment, limited seating, and too many vendors seemingly struggling to attract customers. The event may have become busier later in the evening, and perhaps some vendors eventually did well. However, based on what I personally observed during my visit, I would not be surprised if this year's event turns out to be a financial disappointment for many of the participating businesses. The organizers had a golden opportunity to bring people back after several years away. They should have focused on making the event affordable, welcoming, exciting, and accessible to families. Instead, the prices seemed to discourage spending, and the overall experience lacked the energy and value that made Taste of the Danforth such a popular Toronto tradition. Parking was another major problem that should not be overlooked. With the Danforth streets being blocked off for the festival, parking options were extremely limited. Many visitors coming from outside the immediate area had little choice but to search for parking on surrounding residential side streets. What many of these visitors apparently did not realize was that they could receive a $45 parking ticket for parking without a residential permit. People who had traveled to the area simply to attend and support the festival were greeted with parking enforcement officers issuing tickets. It is hard to imagine a more effective way to discourage people from attending a community event. The city should have anticipated this problem and made reasonable accommodations for the event. At the very least, there should have been clearly marked temporary parking areas, better signage explaining where visitors could and could not park, and some form of reasonable allowance for visitors on the day of the festival. Instead, it seemed as though parking enforcement agents were salivating at the bounty of tickets they could issue. Rather than welcoming visitors to the Danforth and making it easy for them to attend, the parking situation created another financial penalty for people who were simply trying to enjoy the event. There was some paid parking available, but it was difficult to find and even more difficult to access because of the road closures and blocked off streets. Visitors unfamiliar with the area were left driving around looking for somewhere they could legally park, often with very little guidance. This is particularly disappointing because the organizers and the city knew well in advance that thousands of people would be coming to the Danforth. If roads are going to be closed for a major public festival, then parking and transportation arrangements need to be part of the planning. Simply closing streets and leaving visitors to figure out where they can legally park is not adequate. There should have been clear signage well before visitors reach the festival area, directing them to available parking and explaining any restrictions. There could also have been designated visitor parking areas or temporary exemptions on selected side streets. Instead, someone could drive to the Danforth, spend money on gas, travel time, and potentially overpriced festival food, only to return to their vehicle and discover a $45 ticket on the windshield. That is not how you encourage people to support a local festival. The city and organizers should be trying to make visitors feel welcome, not treating them as an opportunity to generate parking ticket revenue. If Taste of the Danforth is supposed to be a major Toronto community event, then accessibility should include making reasonable arrangements for the people who have to drive there. The parking situation was therefore yet another major failure of planning. Between the road closures, limited pay parking, confusing access, and aggressive ticket enforcement, visitors were effectively penalized simply for trying to attend. When you combine that with the high food prices, expensive children's rides, mediocre entertainment, and limited seating, It becomes increasingly difficult to understand what incentive there was for families and visitors from outside the neighborhood to return. Because if this is the new taste of the Danforth, I have to ask myself, why would I come back next year?